What I am about to tell you is not a theory. It is a strategic reality unfolding in real time, and every day it continues. The balance of global power shifts in a direction most people are not even looking at. Okay, pay very close attention. The United States is spending roughly $500 million per day on military operations against Iran. Every day. That is not an abstract number. That is $500 million. Every 24 hours, redirected away from competing in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and the defense of Taiwan. And here is what most people miss. China does not need to win a war against the United States. China just needs the United States to weaken itself. This is not new thinking. This is thousands of years old. The principle is simple. The most efficient victory is the one where your opponent defeats themselves. No direct confrontation, no massive losses, just positioning, patience, and timing. Now step back and look at the players. Player 1, the United States, global military superpower, massive commitments across multiple regions, high operational costs, political pressure to act. Player 2, Iran, regional power, asymmetric capabilities, proxy networks, terrain that favors defense, mountains, urban density, decentralized command structures. Player 3, and this is the one almost nobody is talking about properly, China, industrial superpower, strategic patience, no direct involvement in this conflict, but enormous interest in its outcome. Okay, let me walk you through the structure of this situation, because this is where it becomes very clear. This is not a simple two-player conflict. This is a three-player game. And in game theory, when you have three players, the dynamics change completely. The United States and Iran are locked in a direct confrontation. Costs are immediate, losses are visible, resources are being consumed in real time. China is not in the fight, which means China is not paying the cost. Think about what that actually means. Every missile launched, every sortie flown, every piece of equipment deployed, all of it depletes American resources, financially, militarily, and diplomatically. China's position? It remains intact, stable, expanding. And this is what game theorists call an asymmetric payoff structure. Two players are engaged in a costly interaction. The third player benefits regardless of who wins. Okay, now let's bring geography into this. The Middle East is not just another region. It is one of the most strategically dense areas on the planet. Energy routes, choke points, trade corridors, political fault lines that have existed for decades. Sustained military engagement in this region is not quick, it is not clean, it is prolonged. History tells us that very clearly, and this is where it goes wrong. Because while the United States is committing resources into a geographically complex and politically fragmented region, China is focusing elsewhere, specifically the Pacific. Now I want you to understand something very precise. Under normal conditions, the United States requires 3 to 4 aircraft carrier strike groups positioned in the Pacific to effectively deter any move against Taiwan. 3 to 4. As of April 2026, 2 of those groups are tied down in the Middle East, which means the balance has shifted, and China knows this. Not in a vague sense, not as an assumption, but as a measurable, daily reality. China monitors U.S. carrier positions via satellite, every day, every movement tracked, every deployment analyzed. So this is not guesswork, this is calculation. And here is the key question. If you are China, and you see your primary competitor allocating massive resources to a secondary theater, what is your dominant strategy? You do nothing. You wait. Because the longer this continues, the more the balance shifts in your favor. Okay, now let's add another layer, because this is where it gets very specific and very dangerous. The United States relies on rare earth minerals for its military hardware. F-35 jets, Tomahawk missiles, guided bombs, drones. 90% of those minerals are processed and controlled by China. 90%. In 2025, China imposed export controls on those materials, which means the equation is now locked. The United States is consuming weapons in an active conflict. At the same time, the supply chain needed to rebuild those weapons is controlled by a strategic competitor, and that competitor can restrict supply. Think about what that actually means. The longer the conflict continues, the weaker the replenishment capacity becomes. This is not a battlefield constraint. This is an industrial constraint, and industrial constraints decide long wars. Okay, now zoom out. While bombs are being dropped, infrastructure is being built. China is signing investment deals across Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Turkey. Ports, railways, fiber optic networks, power grids. This is not symbolic. This is physical control over the arteries of a region. So you have one player destroying infrastructure and another player quietly building it. And this is where most analysts stop. But there is a second layer, and it is the one that actually matters. Because this is not just about the present conflict. This is about what happens after it. And that leads to the central question of this entire situation. Is the United States fighting the right opponent in the right place at the right time? Or is it repeating a pattern that history has already shown leads to strategic failure? Okay, now we move from what is happening to what happens next. because this is where the structure becomes unavoidable. There are three scenarios that come out of this situation. Not 10, not 20, three. And each one follows directly from the incentives, the geography, and the constraints we just walked through. I am going to walk you through them step by step, and I want you to pay very close attention to the probabilities, because that is where the signal is. Scenario 1, probability, 15%. The United States achieves a rapid, decisive outcome in Iran. Operations conclude quickly. Resource expenditure is limited. Carrier groups are redeployed back to the Pacific in time to restore deterrence. On the surface, this is the clean scenario, but here is why it is unlikely. Think about the geography. Iran is not flat desert. It is not open terrain. It is mountains, urban centers, and deeply embedded infrastructure. It is a country that has structured its defense around absorbing pressure and dispersing its capabilities. This is the asymmetric warfare model. You do not present a single target. You create hundreds of small ones. So even if the United States applies overwhelming force, the structure of the battlefield prevents rapid resolution. Now add the economic layer. $500 million per day. Every day the operation continues, the cost compounds. Not just financially, but in munitions, logistics, and readiness. And this is where it breaks. A quick war requires a target that can collapse quickly. This is not that target. Okay, historical analogy. Does this sound familiar? It should. This is the Iraq 2003 expectation model. Rapid victory, controlled aftermath. But the geography and the internal structure of the country turned it into a prolonged engagement. So while this scenario exists, the probability stays low, 15%. Scenario 2, probability, 50 to 55%. This is the prolonged engagement scenario. The United States remains operationally active in the Middle East for an extended period. Costs continue. Carrier groups remain partially committed. Resource consumption accelerates, and China continues to do exactly what it is doing right now. Nothing direct, everything indirect. This is what game theorists call a stable equilibrium, but not a positive one. This is a negative-sum game. Both active players, the United States and Iran, incur continuous costs. The third player, China, accumulates advantage over time. Now let me make this very clear. Every additional month in this scenario produces three effects simultaneously. First, military depletion. Weapons are used, stockpiles shrink, replacement capacity is constrained by rare earth supply. Second, financial drain. $500 million per day compounds into tens of billions. That is capital not going into domestic development, not going into technological competition, not going into strategic positioning in Asia. Third, strategic distraction. Attention is finite. Military planning is finite. Political focus is finite, and all of it is being pulled into one region. Okay, now bring geography back into this. While this is happening, the Pacific does not pause. Taiwan does not become less important. China's strategic objectives do not slow down. And this is where the second layer becomes critical. Because China is not reacting to this situation. China is measuring it. Every day. Carrier positions, deployment patterns, response times, resource allocation. This is data, and data becomes strategy. Now here is the key point. In this prolonged scenario, China does not need to act immediately. It only needs to wait until the balance reaches a point where the cost of response for the United States becomes too high. That is the opening. And that is why this scenario sits at 50 to 55%. Because it requires no dramatic shift. It simply requires continuation. Okay, now we move to the third scenario, and this is the one that keeps strategic planners awake. Scenario 3, probability 30 to 35%. This is the Taiwan window scenario. The prolonged engagement continues long enough that the United States cannot rapidly reallocate sufficient naval power back to the Pacific. At that moment, and only at that moment, the strategic window opens. Now pay very close attention. This is not about intention. This is about capability. Under normal conditions, deterrence requires 3 to 4 carrier strike groups in the Pacific. With 2 committed elsewhere, that threshold is not met. So the question becomes very simple. If you are China and you see a temporary reduction in deterrence capability, do you act? Game theory gives you the answer. If the payoff of acting during the window exceeds the payoff of waiting, the dominant strategy is to act during the window. Okay, now layer in the industrial constraint. If the United States is already consuming weapons at a high rate, and China controls 90% of the materials required to replenish those weapons, then the timing of any additional conflict becomes even more critical, because the longer the delay, the more constrained the US becomes. So the window is not just military, it is industrial, and that makes it more valuable. Now bring in the historical analogy. Rome fought Carthage for over a century. Massive commitment, massive focus, total attention on one adversary. While that was happening, Parthia grew in the east, unchecked, unchallenged. So when Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, it turned around and faced a rival that had already reached a level of strength that could not be easily reversed. Does this sound familiar? It should, because the structure is the same. One power focused on an immediate opponent, another power expanding quietly in the background. Okay, now connect the economic layer. because this is where it hits directly. If this third scenario begins to form, markets react before governments do. Energy volatility, supply chain disruption, defense spending spikes, investor uncertainty. And what does that mean for you? Higher prices, slower growth, increased instability. Not in theory, in reality. Okay, now step back. 3 scenarios. 1 unlikely, 1 stable but costly, 1 dangerous and timing dependent. And here is the part most people do not want to say out loud. The second scenario leads directly into the third if it continues long enough. That is the pathway. And that is why this situation matters far beyond the Middle East. Because this is not one conflict. This is a chain reaction. And the next link in that chain is the one that determines the balance of power for the next century. So the real question becomes, at what point does the cost of staying in one theater create vulnerability in another? Stop, because this is the part where everything connects. This is not about Iran. It was never just about Iran. This is about how great powers lose their position, not in a single moment, not in a dramatic collapse, but through a series of decisions that all make sense individually and fail collectively. Okay, let's bring this down to what it actually means. Every day this conflict continues, resources move in one direction, out, $500 million per day. Weapons systems being used, stockpiles shrinking, carrier groups tied to a single region. At the same time, and this is critical, nothing equivalent is being lost on the other side of the global balance. China is not spending $500 million per day in this conflict. China is not deploying carrier groups into this theater. China is not depleting its weapons stockpiles here, which means the gap changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly. And that is how strategic shifts actually happen. Okay, now think about the economic layer, because this is where it becomes real for you. When a country allocates massive financial resources into sustained military operations, that money does not disappear. It is redirected, and that has consequences. Less investment in technology, less investment in infrastructure, less flexibility in responding to economic shocks. At the same time, uncertainty increases. Markets react to instability. Supply chains react to instability. Energy systems react to instability. And when those systems react, prices move. Fuel prices, food prices, transportation costs, everything that depends on stable global systems becomes more expensive. This is not abstract. This is your daily life. Okay, now layer in the infrastructure dimension. While one side is actively engaged in destruction, the other is engaged in construction. Ports are being financed, rail lines are being built, digital networks are being installed, power systems are being connected. These are not temporary assets. They are long-term control mechanisms. Because whoever builds the infrastructure shapes the flow of trade, information, and energy. And that is power. Not theoretical power, not symbolic power, real, measurable control over how a region functions. So when the United States eventually reduces its presence in the Middle East, and history suggests that prolonged engagements do not last forever, the question is not who won the war. The question is, who owns what remains? Okay, and this is where the zoom out becomes unavoidable. This is not a new pattern. This is a repeated structure. A dominant power engages heavily in one region. A rising power expands quietly in another. By the time the dominant power turns its attention, the balance has already shifted. And this is what game theorists would describe as a delayed realization of a strategic loss. Because at every step, the moves made sense locally. Respond to the immediate threat. Allocate resources where pressure is highest. Maintain credibility. All rational, all logical, and collectively, they create vulnerability elsewhere. That is the structure. Okay, now let's bring back the historical parallel. Rome versus Carthage. 120 years of conflict, massive commitment, total focus, victory eventually. But while that victory was being pursued, Parthia grew. So when Rome turned east, it was no longer facing a manageable competitor. It was facing a strategic equal. And that is the tragedy of it. Victory in one arena can create defeat in another. Okay, now connect this directly to the present structure. The United States is engaged in a costly conflict in one region. China is expanding its economic and industrial influence across multiple regions. At the same time, China holds leverage over critical supply chains, including the materials required to rebuild military capacity. So you have 3 simultaneous dynamics: resource depletion, industrial constraint, infrastructure expansion. And all 3 move in the same direction, away from balance, toward asymmetry. Okay, and here is where most people misunderstand what power actually is. Power is not just military strength. Power is the ability to sustain that strength over time. If you cannot replenish what you use, your strength declines. If your competitor can control your replenishment, your strength becomes conditional. Think about that. That is not a battlefield problem. That is a systemic problem. Okay, now let's bring this back to the core question. Is this about winning or losing a single conflict? No, this is about positioning across multiple theaters simultaneously. And when one theater consumes disproportionate resources, the others become exposed. That is the trade-off. And trade-offs are where outcomes are decided. Okay, so what does all of this mean in plain terms? It means that the outcome of this situation is not determined solely by what happens in the Middle East. It is determined by what happens everywhere else while attention is focused there. It means that strategic advantage can be built without direct confrontation. It means that time, not just force, becomes the deciding variable. And it means that the most important moves in this entire situation may be the ones that are not visible as conflict. Okay, now I want you to understand one final thing, because this is the part that changes how you see everything. China does not need to fire a single shot in this scenario. It does not need to initiate direct conflict. It only needs the current structure to continue. Because if it continues, the incentives, the geography, the economics, and the timelines all align in the same direction. And that direction is not neutral. It is cumulative. And cumulative shifts are how centuries are decided. Okay, what I want you to take away from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. What is useful is understanding. Because when you understand the incentives, when you understand the geography, when you understand how resources move and how constraints build, you stop reacting to events and you start seeing patterns. And when you see the patterns, you can see what is coming before it happens. And that is the most powerful thing you can have in a world that is changing this fast.